Tony? I don't know. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell me nothing.
He's waiting for a phone call.
He's waiting for a phone
From
call.
whom, I don't know.
Oh, mystery, huh?
Who is in here? Oh, Carolyn.
Carolyn, yeah, she's at probably a VFW thing, probably, or who knows, or a doctor appointment, or
You might be calling Tony.
Yeah, she might be calling Tony. All right. So we get to start a whole new chapter today. Boy, that's a lot of fun. Chapter 14 of Romans. Chapter 14 of Romans is not a famous chapter. Let's put it that way. Chapter 8, big famous chapter. Chapter 3, big famous chapter. Chapter 16, big famous chapter for numerous reasons. 14 kind of, well, what's 14 about? Now, 14 is really more timely for Paul's time. It is, it's an example of, in all Paul's letters, of course, you understand that he is answering very often questions from people or answering situations that have come up in the new church, in the New Testament church. When he does that, we might look at that and we can say, well, but that doesn't apply to us because we're not having that problem. In Corinthians, for example, one of the things that he deals with in Corinthians is that these were relatively affluent people, and they were very used to taking each other to court for frivolous reasons and suing each other and trying to win money over things. And
History repeats.
yeah. Inside a Christian congregation in the last 100 years, let's say, that's not a deal in most cases. So you would wonder, well, okay, why do we bother even studying that portion of 1 Corinthians? Because the principle there builds upon things that Jesus taught himself for example, in the Sermon on the Mount. Also, the kind of immorality that Paul had to deal with new believers who were still kind of working their way out of their paganism. They were still working their way out of their heathen practices. And so in our culture, especially 100 years ago, but even recently, in our culture, the pastor probably is not going to address a problem of numerous parishioners, numerous members, making continued use of the town prostitutes. That's usually not something that I'm going to work into my sermons, because that's just not a thing among Christians today, among New Testament Christians today. It was. People were having a hard time breaking away from those habits, from those practices. And so Paul would address those things. Okay, so here in Romans, in chapter 14, he's going to do the same thing. He's going to address an issue that we don't have around us anymore. We don't have religions around us anymore that are doing animal sacrifices. Not even the Jews. The Jews do not do animal sacrifices, unless if someday, they ever rebuild a temple in Jerusalem, they might. There are Jewish factions that say they will do that, and they're planning to do that. I doubt seriously that will ever happen, but other than that, there just aren't. I mean, even Wiccans that might meet in our area. This is a pretty heavy, active area for witches and Wiccans. They'll sacrifice a cat once in a while, or maybe a goat, but that's pretty rare even. Okay, you don't have on a corner in town a temple, for example, to Zeus or whatever, and you would go there and get roasts on sale. Let's pop on down to the Zeus temple and pick up a couple rump roasts, whatever. That's just not a thing. Okay, so that's what Paul's talking about. That's what Paul's dealing with, because the butcher shops in Greece and Rome areas were temples. Just like in the Jewish temple, the priests were trained to be butchers, because it had to be, because certain of the sacrifices in the Old Testament called for certain portions of the animal carcass. Okay? So you had to know, you had to be trained as a priest, you had to be trained as a butcher, you had to be trained to be able to take out kidneys and hearts and livers and that kind of thing, and to put that aside for certain sacrifices. And then you had to learn how to bleed out the animals and all kinds of things. And so that's the same, it was also true in other religions. Religions that had animal sacrifice, of which there were many, many, many who had animal sacrifices. So that was the place you would go. And of course, they weren't burnt all the time. Sometimes they were presented to the so-called God, and that was about it. And there would be leftovers. And so people would go to those places if they wanted to have a party and they wanted leg a lamb, to serve their guests. They would go to the temple of Nerva or whatever and say, hey, you got any lamb legs left over from your sacrifices today? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. A couple shekels, there you go. That's not a thing for us. And so when Paul talks about this stuff, we're going to say to ourselves perhaps, well, why are we bothering to read this? Because it has no application to us. Okay, the specific incident has no application, but the principle does have application. The principle about things that are devoted, if you will, or created even, or produced even, specifically for a false doctrine or a false teaching or a false religion. Okay, those things are around, and that's what we're going to wind up talking about here. Okay, all right. So, chapter 14, before we read any verses, let's just look a few at the introduction there on page 115. Most of what Paul discusses in this chapter is related to the fact that Christianity was born from Judaism. So it came out of Judaism. For many Christians today, the specific issues Paul mentions are no longer relevant, but the principles still are. For most Jewish Christians, it was difficult to understand which parts of the Mosaic Law had lost their relevance and which were still valid. Even among the apostles, many issues were not clear. So, of course, the things we're going through in the book of Exodus on Sundays, a lot of very detailed laws there about the animals that you can eat, the animals you can't eat, the way in which you prepare the animals for eating, the parts of the animal that you can eat and can't eat. Terry?
Yeah, just to help me focus on this,
Yeah.
What time was this after Christ had risen and left?
Okay, so again, the book of Romans is written approximately between 55 and 65 AD. So 30 years.
30 years.
Give or take.
It just helps to understand the questions coming out that he's dealing
Right.
with.
Well, the temple Jerusalem is not overtaken yet. Paul dies in 64. Jerusalem is destroyed in 70. So the temple is still there. And also the Jerusalem Council has been held. But as you will notice, if you go to the book of Acts, you will notice that in the Jerusalem Council, there were a lot of questions. And you may even find it a little odd that some of the conclusions that the Jerusalem Council, which was the first joint church council, okay, one of the things they decided, for example, is that you couldn't eat meat of animals that were strangled, okay? Now, we read that in the book of Acts and we say, well, why is that? Okay, it has to do with what we're going to be talking about in chapter 14. Okay, part of the problem with the old Jewish laws were that they became a real stumbling block for new believers. All right. New believers in Jesus, for the most part, they accepted the idea that Jesus had fulfilled the old law. Okay? And so they didn't need to fulfill it themselves. Okay? Jesus fulfilled it in their place. That was known. I won't say it was understood, but it was known. It was preached. It was taught that Jesus fulfilled the old law in our place. That's why he came as a human being. Okay? So that was taught. Okay? At the same time, people still felt odd. They still felt funny. It's like Peter when he was at Cornelius' house and God showed him that vision and said, eat these things, eat this pig here. And Peter said, oh, never, I can't do that. I've met people who have come out of Judaism and come into Christianity, not as Messianic Jews necessarily, but wanting to be Sunday morning, not Saturday morning Christians, wanting to be New Testament Christians. But even they sometimes find it very hard, to sit down and, chow down on spare ribs. They have a hard time with it, okay? So this is what's going on. And it hasn't been that many years, okay? It's been 30 years since Jesus has ascended, Pentecost and all that. But that's not a long time. Even when you're only living 45 or 50, it's still not a real long time for these ideas. Again, they're known, they're taught, they're preached, but to them to sink in and become part of your everyday life. Okay, a little bit more time needs to go by. I'd say a good 100 years anyway. As I say, it was understood that the death of Christ was the fulfillment of the ceremonial law, and that, for example, the requirements to sacrifice an animal in order to obtain forgiveness had become obsolete. That's no longer required. But even Peter struggled with the question of eating the meat of certain animals that the Mosaic law had declared unclean. When he received a vision, which I was just talking about, in which he was ordered to kill and eat animals that were not kosher, he answered, "Surely not I, Lord. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." So, in the book of Acts, this is years, at least a year and a half, 2 years after Pentecost. Also, when the First Council of Jerusalem adopted a motion which was said to the churches, mostly Gentile believers, they advised them to abstain from foods polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from meat of strangled animals and blood. Now, this is odd to us again. Not only is it odd to have, the apostles declare that, we shouldn't eat blood sausage, for example. We shouldn't eat meat from strangled animals, and to put that on the same level with prostitution, okay, or idolatry. We wouldn't put those on the same level, would we? We would say idolatry, that's pretty blasphemous, and then we'd say, polluting ourselves with prostitutes or whatever, that's pretty bad. Then we would say eating strangled meat, who cares? Right? Or a blood sausage, who cares? If you can tolerate that kind of thing, who cares, right? So we would put those things in totally different categories, and here the apostles put them all on the same level. To us, that's just weird. That's just really strange. We should note that sexual immorality in this context pertained primarily to participating in pagan temple rites, although adultery and fornication is also included. And by temple rites, I mean the temple prostitutes, of course, who were there for that purpose. There was a period of growing awareness in the early church as to the meaning of the Old Testament ceremonies for New Testament believers. Peter and John participated in the temple prayers in Jerusalem at which animal sacrifices were brought. This continued. Christians continued to go to the temple up until the time the temple was destroyed. Christian Jews or Jewish believers, however you want to put it, and perhaps even Gentiles, we don't know, we're not told, may have gone to the temple on a daily, weekly basis, continued right up till the time the temple was destroyed, and continued to fulfill the ceremonial laws. That's possible, that they could have been doing that. Again, the apostles themselves felt a need to go to the temple. Of course, they didn't have churches of their own yet, but they felt a need to go to the temple. They felt a need to go to the temple to pray. They felt a need to go to the temple and listen to the lessons. They felt a need to go to the temple and go through the sacrifices still. These are the apostles, folks. Okay? So even though Jesus has come, Jesus has died and risen, has ascended, has sent the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, all that has taken place, and so on and so forth. At the same time, these people are so connected, so stuck, so close to the Old Testament that they cannot just break free right away from it. They just can't stop, going to the temple. So we should understand this. When Paul's writing this is still going on. Did you have something?
Well, it just, something fired off in my head here, that prophecy has been fulfilled.
Yeah.
I don't think it pertains to today, where he says, don't come down off your roof, just head off into the hills.
Yeah.
Don't go back and get anything. So that, I think, was for 70 AD. Right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
I think
Oh yeah,
that
definitely.
because
Don't
today
waste time.
they-
Yeah, once you see, he says, once you see, the abomination of desolation, all right, which some people take to be take to be the Roman eagle, okay,
Yeah.
and that and the sign of the Roman Senate. I'm not sure that that's provable, but anyway, when you see that, and when you see them digging a trench, around the Jerusalem and such, get out of it. Don't wait. Don't diddle daddle. Get out of town as quick as you can, because you don't know when that circle is going to be completed. Once that circle is completed, you're done. It's over. You're going to be slaughtered. You're going to be wiped out. And so Jesus was very, very, very clear. I mean, you cannot read those passages in Matthew 25 and 26 and 24 too, but you cannot read those without thinking of Titus and Vespasian, the son and general and his son, surrounding Jerusalem with a trench, earthworks, siege engines, and hemming them in and starving them out until finally they were able to conquer the city. It's a perfect. Jesus gives a perfect description of the Roman way of war when it comes upon a big city like that, and that's exactly, of course, what happened.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. Paul participated in some temple rites at Jerusalem that involved purification according to Old Testament law for the Nazirite vow. Remember, again, in Acts, we have the story of Paul taking a Nazirite vow, which is Old Testament ceremonial law. He takes a Nazirite vow, cuts his hair, and all this kind of stuff, and actually goes to the temple in order to complete his vow. So here we got the greatest evangelist, the greatest evangelist to the Gentiles, the greatest exponent of salvation without works. And what's he doing? He's doing a work, isn't he? Now, he's not doing it to be saved, that's for sure, but still, he's participating in Old Testament ceremonial law. Indeed, Paul demonstrated what seems like inconsistency in the following of principles he set for his own life and that of others. He argued vehemently against imposing circumcision on new converts, yet he personally circumcised Timothy. Okay? When Timothy came, Timothy was from a Greek-Roman family. When Timothy became a Christian, he had been kind of a proselytized Jew in a sense. In other words, his mother and grandmother had taught him from Old Testament and things like that, but he had never been circumcised. Paul did it himself, okay? And then he proclaimed that Christ is the end of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes, and yet he submitted to some parts of the Old Testament law himself, okay? So he circumcised Timothy, but he refused to have Bartholomew and others, or Bartimaeus, not Bartimaeus, I can't think of the name, but anyway, he refused to have some of them, Barnabas, excuse me, he refused to have them circumcised. Okay? And you have to read the context, you have to know why that was. And again, it has to do with the principles we're going to see in chapter 14. And so it's not a hard and fast rule that, well, you just do this or you don't do that. There's something new involved here. And the big thing that's involved here in chapter 14 is going to be something that before was not that important. And now all of a sudden it's very important. The Jews didn't care much about conscience. And there was not a whole lot of conscience in the law of the Old Testament. It was do this, don't do that, period. Okay, there wasn't a lot of well, if you think this way, then do that. If you think that way, then no. But all of a sudden now in the New Testament, the idea of conscience for New Testament believers comes very much into view. We take for granted principles of conscience. Okay? Conscientious objectors, for example. We take that for granted. That's been a part of our nation's history since, really, since all the way back to the Revolutionary War. Okay, so since the beginning. Okay, there have been conscientious objectors, people who said, well, I just can't kill anybody. I just can't. My conscience won't deal with that. Can't deal with that. Okay, we take that for granted. And the whole idea of conscience came up through the Middle Ages and became part of political thought and part of our political discourse. It wasn't before. So we take it for granted. But believe me, in Paul's day and in the day of the Romans, conscience was one of the last things anybody would think of. Conscience didn't matter for the most part. Conscience was just not there. People had ethics and scruples, yes, but didn't connect it very often with the conscience. The conclusion we draw from all of this is that in Paul's mind, the only important issue was motivation. That someone keeping the old law in a work-righteous way or only for conscience sake. And that becomes the principle that we're going to be focusing on during this chapter. If you're doing something for work-righteous reason, if you're doing something in order to impress God, if you're doing something in order to pay off a sin, if you're doing something in order to appease God, okay, that's wrong motivation. That's wrong motivation every single time. Okay. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you don't do it. We'll deal with that as we go along here. If, on the other hand, whatever you're doing, and could be doing the exact same thing, exact same activity, but you're doing it out of love for being saved, love for God for saving you, love for God for creating you, thanks to God for some great event in your life, whatever, okay, then that's always good. That's always proper and always good, no matter what it is. It could be something very, very tiny, or it could be something giant. Okay. So motivation is the end all and be all, really, of this whole issue. Next page. To the Galatians, he wrote in the strongest possible terms. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again with the yoke of slavery. That is work righteousness, of course. Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, this is talking to the people up in Turkey who were not Jews, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. Okay, you want to do that? Fine. You do that, but then you keep the entire rest of the Old Testament ceremonial law. Every jot and tittle. You can't have it both ways. You can't just up and decide, well, I'm going to do this little thing in the Old Testament law, but I'm not going to do that little thing over here. This is the thing that's so crazy about the Jews today, for example. Okay? This is what's so nuts about it. All right? Especially look at the Hasidic or the ultra-Orthodox, right? Who have the 2 kitchens or the 2 refrigerators and all this kind of stuff, okay? 2 sets of plates, They're so picky. They want to make absolutely sure that a piece of cheese and a piece of meat does not end up on the same plate. Okay? So intent about that. So intent about, how far they can walk on the Sabbath. So intent about all kinds of tiny little ceremonial laws. And yet, the biggest ceremonial law, which was, not a choice, it was not an option. Do sacrifices. Every day there were to be sacrifices done. Every single day. They were to be done in Jerusalem. They were to be done either on or about, anywhere at least close to, Mount Moriah. Okay? They don't care about that. And when they were dispersed from Israel after the destruction of Jerusalem, or even hundreds of years later after the last Jewish war, and they were forbidden ever to come back. 210 AD, the Romans told them that's it. They got all the Jews out of Palestine complete ethnic cleansing, and told them you can't come back ever. And they did for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. Anyway, they took off to all parts. They didn't declare this area, this is going to be our sacrificial hill, and we're going to do sacrifices now. Bring the goat and the lamb, and let's go. No, so they totally and completely ignore huge chapters, giant chunks of the ceremonial law, while they keep tiny little portions of the ceremonial law. And they think, well, that's just fine. Well, that's okay. Well, we can do that. We can't do the other, so we could do that. So, what does God tell them that in Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers? Does he say, well, if you find yourself in a position where you're not, you can't do that, well then, you're off the hook. No, God never says that. God never says that. He said, you will do this. You will do these 7 ceremonies every year. You will have the scapegoat out in the wilderness every year. You will have the Passover lamb every year. You will have, they do, well, give them credit, they do Passover, okay? But you will have the Day of Atonement, sacrificed and the blood sprinkled on the altar. You will do that. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no options, no nothing. You will do that. Otherwise, I will curse you. And they just say, well, we can't get away with that nowadays. Nobody will let us do that, and so we won't bother. But boy, we'll make sure not to have meat and cheese on the same plate. I mean, really, folks, when you boil it down, when you really start looking at it, it has to come off as completely stupid and completely foolish. And how millions of people have been persuaded to do this is mind-boggling. At least to me it is. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. So if you have really decided in your mind, I must be circumcised, or I must do this sacrifice, or I must whatever do this in order to be saved, you're not a believer anymore. You're not a believer anymore. Okay? This is why we say the Mormons are not believers. They can call themselves Christians all day long, but they're not. They're not believers. Okay? Because they're trying to save themselves by their works. They are trying to appease God. They're trying to get their planet and whatever by works. They are no longer, therefore, or never were, but they cannot claim to be Christians. They cannot claim to be believers. And that's true of anybody else. It doesn't matter whether you're in the Elka Church, or whether you're in the Methodist Church, or the Presbyterian Church, or United Church, or Baptist Church. If you are doing things, if you're giving up booze or dancing or whatever in order to be saved, you are not a believer. Period. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot say, I am saved by grace through faith, and then say also, but I also got to keep the commandments and I also got to do this in order to be saved. You can't, you're saved one way. You pick, okay? And of course, you can't pick. Yeah, the Holy Spirit moves you to pick, but still, you pick. You want to be saved by your works, Paul says, fine, you be saved by works. Good luck to you. Have a nice life. Enjoy hell. Okay? You want to be saved by grace through faith? Wonderful. Okay? Then, of course, you do these things over here. You do the law, but not for the reason of being saved. You do the law because you are saved. Huge, gigantic difference. Couldn't be more different than night or day. Again, same exact action. Honor your father and mother. Okay? Honor your marriage vows. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't cheat. Okay? Same exact actions. One done because you're saved, good. One done in order to be saved, bad. Same exact action, different motivations make all the difference in the world. And that's what he was telling the Galatians, and that's what he's going to be telling us here in Romans. By faith we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. When it comes to Christ, your works have no value. No matter what they are. No matter how good they are. They have no value compared with Christ. Because Christ has applied all of his works to you. By grace through faith. The only thing that counts is faith, expressing itself through love. So again, if you're doing these acts as a manner of expression of your thanks and love and praise and worship of God, great, wonderful, fantastic, have at it. Keep the law, absolutely, by all means. Just not in order to be saved, but rather because you are already saved. Again, huge, gigantic difference. In Rome, as in all other centers of the Roman Empire, the main source of meat was the pagan temple. This meant that the animals had been sacrificed to an idol. This made some Christians decide to become vegetarians. Interestingly, Paul qualifies those people as having weak faith. We tend to consider those who categorically reject all the world has to offer as being the strong Christians. But Paul says that spiritual strength shows itself in discernment. Now, there is a word for you. Discernment. That's not an everyday run-of-the-mill 10-cent word. That's your 99-cent college term there. But we'll talk about that. Wholesale rejection? No. Discernment? Yes. I heard one pastor argue once against all classical music, saying that some composers had led immoral lives, and that one could not know how much of that was expressed in their compositions. Oh my goodness, don't ever listen to Mozart. Oh, he was immoral in so many ways. Oh, you can't listen to Beethoven. Oh, you can't listen to Rachmaninoff. You shouldn't really listen to, whomever, because, they got drunk all the time, or they had affairs, or whatever. And some of that stuff might be in their music. Okay, that was his idea, this guy. If that was true of classical music, how much more so of rock and roll today, or country? I mean, think about it. Think about Mick Jagger, for example. How many times that guy's been married? How many girlfriends has he had? How many, really, how many times has he got drugged out of his mind? Really.
He writes a song, Sympathy for the Devil.
Sympathy to the Devil, right. Actually, Sympathy for the Devil is actually a great song. If you want to understand the devil's thinking. It's almost like it was dictated to him by the devil.
Well, I mean, you have to feel sorry for him because he knows everybody hates him. The devil.
Oh, well, I suppose. I don't think he cares, frankly, one way or another. But, think of it, let me introduce myself to you, right? It's just, and that's just one example. I mean, my goodness, Ozzy Osbourne, AC/DC, my goodness, Black Sabbath, Nazareth, Megadeth, whoever, Pearl Jam, Kurt Cobain's bunch. What was Kurt Cobain's group? Nirvana. You know, I mean, some of these people have just, and so, if you're going to say, well, we're going to get rid, I'm just, la 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 la, I'm not going to listen to that, okay? Well, okay, fine, good luck, all right, first, you're in the mall, boom, it'll, show you up. But that's not the issue, that's not the point, okay? That's not the issue, okay? The issue is other things. I mean, is that an idol to you? I don't know, it might be to some people.
The album, or the Jesus Christ Superstar, which is
Dumb, yeah.
dumb, but it was a song in that album that I just broke down crying, and I could see the blood coming down off the
Sure,
cross.
yeah, yeah.
So it drew me,
Yeah,
to the Lord. Were they Christians? No.
No. If it is sinful to use things produced by sinners, none of us would live very well or very long. I mean, think about it, folks. If you really wanted to take this to the nth degree, if we as a church, let's say, we would have to know what the morality was of the people who made these tables, what the religious background was of the people who made the paint on the walls or manufactured the light fixtures. You see where this is going? It gets to a point where you might as well live in a cave, and wear spider webs and drink rainwater. And what you're going to eat, I don't know, beetles. Because the world is contaminated top to bottom. Not only with idols, but with immoral things and people. Go ahead.
So, what's the difference between listening to music from a sinner when we're also sinners? We're also sinners.
Right, so what was the first part of the question?
What's the difference between listening to music made
Oh.
from a sinner when we're also sinners?
Right. Well, but this is the argument that is used, okay?
We're sinner.
This is the argument that I've had pastors tell me. This is I tell my confirmation kids, you cannot listen to rock and roll. You just can't. You just absolutely can't. That's out. That's verboten. That's out. Okay. And well, why? Well, because it's sinful. I even had a professor. This was a professor, a college professor, not a seminary professor, but a college professor, teach our class that the beat of rock music was itself, before you even get to the melody or rhythm, the beat itself, which was the backbeat. Okay, those of you who know music, you know that. What do you say?
What is the drummer I got?
Right, it for other types of music, okay, it's the, for lack of a better term, front beat. Okay, classical music, what do you call it? Marching music, okay, whatever. It's the front beat. For rock and roll, and most of country too, and a lot of blues and jazz, it's the backbeat. And this professor, had an entire hour lecture on where the backbeat came from and what cultures use it and why it is of itself, just by itself, satanic.
Africa?
Okay? Africa, right. It came out of Africa. Maybe South America too, but mostly Africa. And he had slides, boy, and he, and he had samples. He would put the record on and put the samples on. He would, and I will have to agree with one thing, and I think you will agree with this too. Whether your favorite music is jazz or blues or rock and roll or country, if it has a backbeat to it, I think you will agree that if you put that on, and then you put on Rachmaninoff, okay, that you will have a hard time not tapping your toe to the rock and roll or whatever. The backbeat does have a, shall we say, natural, maybe natural is not the best term, but a more humanistic, okay, more humanistic feel to it. It has a feel. This professor said this is our innate rebellion as human beings to have the accent on the back beat rather than the front beat. Okay? The front beat, he said, is godly. The back beat is satanic. That was what he said. That's what he taught. Okay? And I did have a couple of pastor friends who, after this, threw out their rock and roll collections, threw out their stereos, threw out their 8-track tapes. This is a long time ago. Okay? I had one particular classmate at seminary who literally picked up his television, because he had one of those things, televisions with a player on it, and threw it down the stairs of his apartment complex. And as far as I know, he just passed away here not too long ago. As far as I know, he never owned another TV after that. But this is my point, though. See, that if you want to do that, if you're going to do that, if you're going to say, well, that beat or that color, there's some people that talk about colors as being satanic, okay? That sound, a particular instrument, for example, is satanic, or something like that. And then, of course, the morality or the beliefs of the people who produce things like that. If you're going to go that direction, you should be consistent. And if you are consistent, like I say, you wind up living in a cave, dressed in spider webs and drinking rainwater and eating beetles. Because everything else in this world has sin connected to it. And as Laura very astutely pointed out, we're sinners anyway. It's not going to stop us from sinning, right? Just because you don't listen to the Rolling Stones is not going to mean you're not going to sin. Okay, right. All right. So yeah, that should be a good point too. So while the issue of eating meat that is sacrificed to idols is no longer relevant in our day, the principle of discernment still is. We could make a long list of supposed Christian taboos that dominate the daily life of sincere believers in Christ. But in doing so, we might leave out some that would offend one person and not the other. So if I gave you a sheet of paper and had you write down 10 things that you think Christians ought not participate in, or not have in their homes, or whatever, I bet you the lists wouldn't match. You would have things on your list that I would think is stupid. And on the other hand, you would not have things on your list that I think would be obvious. I saw just on the internet the other day, I ran across a recently converted person. This was a person who was into New Age, real big time. Was into New Age, was into witches, and was into Satanism, big time. And she got out of that, and she became a Christian. And she now has a podcast, like everybody does, right? And in this podcast, which I happened to catch, she was talking about 10 things you have to take out of your house. You just have to take out of your house because they will lead you astray. Okay? And of course, rock and roll records were way up on the list. That's one of the things. There were some other things that were very innocuous, and I can't remember. I should have written them down. But again, she didn't have some things on her list that I thought would be pretty obvious. Okay, I mean, I think she mentioned satanic connected things, or like a pentagram or a poster with satanic looking characters on it, or whatever like that. And so, she listed those things. But there were other things on there that I thought she could have listed, she didn't. But this is the thing with this kind of thing. Once you go down that road, now, as we're going to find, as we go further into this chapter, as we're going to find, if these things assault your conscience, then that becomes a different matter. Now you're talking about things that you yourself think are having a bad effect on you, or you may even know that they're having a bad effect on you, or had a bad effect on you at some point in your life. All right? And that's a little different. And as we see, this is part of discernment, which we're going to spend a lot of time on in the next few weeks. Number 11, the solution Paul offers is abstaining from judgment. You may judge yourself, of course, and that's okay. But refrain from judging others. Okay? My wife likes Celtic stuff, Irish stuff. Okay? Some Celtic things go back beyond the time when Ireland was Christian. Celtic knots, for example, and certain designs in Celtic fabric and whatever predate the Christianization of Ireland. And so they may represent the Druid beliefs or the false gods of the Celts at the time. Okay? Doesn't bother her. Doesn't bother her one bit. Doesn't bother me. Okay? But there are people, I think this lady was one who said Celtic knots, any kind of Celtic knot fabric or Celtic knot design should be take it out because it's satanic. Okay? So in her house, you know, her conscience tells her, I can't have that. I got to get rid of that. Okay? I got to get rid of that. I would say to her, fine, but don't tell me I have to get rid of it. Okay? Right?
Sir?
Yeah.
I'm always questioned by my Messianic friends why I have a cross in
Right.
my house,
Mm-hmm.
or I wear a cross.
Right.
I think we've talked about
Mm-hmm.
this. Because they feel that I'm worshiping the cross.
Right, right,
And I'm going, well, it's not really, I'm not worshiping the cross.
right.
I have one in my house and I wear one around my neck primarily to remind me if I'm ever in a situation, all I have to do is just touch this cross and I know God is with me.
Right.
I know He's with me all the time, but it's just a physical reminder.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Well, this is the thing with what the Romans call sacramentals. All right? What's a sacramental? Okay? A sacramental is not a sacrament. It doesn't give forgiveness. Okay? But a sacramental is a thing in the Roman Church that is a reminder of grace. Some grace of God, some act of grace from God. Okay, so the sign of the cross is a sacramental, all right? It doesn't have any intrinsic power of its own. Now, you'll meet Romans who would not agree with that. There's plenty of Romans out there, and in the Roman Church, even though they kind of try to teach away from it, it still happens that making the sign of the cross has power in and of itself to disperse demons and so on and so forth. Okay? It's not the action that has that power. It is your belief, your faith, and God that is with you that has that power, obviously. Okay? But it's a sacramental. All right? Or even a rosary is a sacramental. All right? It is supposed to be an aid to help you keep track of your prayers. Now, of course, repetitious prayer is not, something that the Bible speaks highly of. So there's really no need to keep track of it. Okay? On the other hand, okay, there is, you may or may not know, such a thing as a Lutheran rosary. It does exist. Lutheran rosaries exist. They're mostly used by Scandinavian Lutherans. Okay? And it's not so much repetition of prayers as it is, how will we say, the content of prayers. Okay? To remember your mother, your father, your children, your grandchildren, your brothers and sisters, to remember this and that, or to say certain portions of repeat certain portions of the catechism and so on and so forth. Okay, Lutheran rosary has a little bit more broad use than a Catholic rosary. But it is very common, if you will find them, if you go visit in Norway or Sweden, Denmark, Finland, you will see Lutherans clutching their Lutheran rosaries. And for all intents and purposes, at first glance, they don't look that much different. It's kind of hard to tell the difference when just glancing. You'll have to actually lay them down and look at them to see the difference. Okay, so that can be useful. It can be very useful. Having a cross in your house can be very useful. Wearing a cross can be very useful. Okay? So these things that are what the Romans call sacramentals, we would just call them symbols. but they can be very useful, and they can be actions, they can be words, they can be items, they can be all kinds of things that are good. But there again, if you think the power is in them, and if you're trying to use them as, well, I have this thing, I have this little wooden cross, let's say, I carry in my pocket, some people do that, therefore the devil can't get me. Well, that's wrong. That's wrong thinking, okay? That the power is not in the shamrock, okay? That's not where the power is. The power is in the Trinity, obviously. And so on and so forth. And so holy water, you want to buy a vial of Jordan holy water from somebody, fine, go ahead and do that, just for kicks. But if you think for 1 minute that holy water, you're ready, the vampire shows up and you've splashed on them and they melt, well, you'll be real surprised. That's not going to happen, okay? So there's a lot of this stuff that's going around, and a lot we'll talk about as we go. As a matter of fact, that's the question today. Paul says in Colossians, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. I mean, that right there should be etched in the brains of Baptists and yes, Romans and a bunch of other Christians too. Don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. If you want a glass of wine, have a glass of wine. If you like bourbon, have bourbon. Just don't overdo it, okay? And if you don't, fine. That's okay too, all right? But don't be telling people, you got to do this or you got to do that, otherwise you're not a believer or you're not saved. That's where it's wrong. Or with regard to religious festival, a new moon celebration, or the Sabbath day. Don't let anybody tell you. These crazy Seventh-day Adventists down here, they go apoplectic over this. If you worship on Sunday, you are going to hell. That's what they tell you. Straight out. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no stop at go, don't collect $200, nothing. You go straight to hell if you worship on Sunday. Period. That's just plain stupid for innumerable reasons. But, and especially, here it is in the Bible right there. Do not let anyone judge you on the Sabbath day.
How do they get past that verse? How do they get around that? Did they
Believe me, they do.
kind of know their Bible?
No, they don't. They have all kinds of twisted ways to explain that. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. So in Jesus, you want to worship on Thursday at 2 o'clock in the morning? Be my guest. I won't be here. But if you want to be here, I'll give you a key. You can let yourself in. Okay? The time we decide to worship is totally in our freedom in Christ. And how we worship. And, people will judge me, by the way, and you, this congregation, oh, you guys, you have to use that liturgy thing. No, we don't. I choose, as your shepherd, I choose to use the liturgy for a particular reason. And it's really it's a very good reason, okay? Believe it or not, I have my days when I am not on my A game. All right? It happens, right? And even though every Sunday somebody comes walking out and says, what a marvelous sermon that was, there are a lot of Sundays I come walking out and I say, oh boy, man, that really stunk. And so the reason I choose to have us follow the liturgy is not simply because it's well known and comfortable and covers a lot of truths, but it's gospel-centered. It's gospel-centered. We start with the confession absolution. That's the gospel. The Kyrie, the Gloria Excelsis, the Gloria Patri are gospel-centered, are gospel-oriented. The Agnus Dei and all the rest are gospel-centered. The readings, okay, are chosen for that reason. The reason we have Lord's Supper every Sunday, that is the gospel in in physical form. Okay, the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So that when my sermon doesn't have much gospel in it, and that happens from time to time, whether you know it or not. When I get on my horse once in a while and I start yelling and screaming about, what some people are doing or this false doctrine or that false doctrine, sometimes the gospel doesn't always come out the way it ought to. Well, you know what? I don't worry about that. The reason I don't worry about that is because after my sometimes lousy sermon, we get to have the Lord's Supper and we get to have the gospel in bread and wine. And so, whether my sermon is gospel-oriented or not, the whole rest of the service is. In other words, I use the liturgy to cover my butt. And I pity my brother pastors out there who don't use the liturgy, who don't have much liturgy at all, if any, because the whole Sunday then rests on their shoulders. I have 2,000 years of church history to fall back on. They got nothing. It's them or else. It's either they got to be spot on, and by George, their sermon has got to be 100% law, 100% gospel, and right to the point and everything else, and got to be the best thing since sliced bread. Otherwise, people are not going to get fed. I don't have to worry about that. My people are going to get fed even if I ain't there. My people are going to get fed if I start my sermon and fall over dead. Please, continue with the service. Just continue with the service. All right? Carry me out feet first later. Okay? You don't need me. You got it. You got the liturgy, you got the Lord's Supper, you got everything you need. I'm frosting. I'm this little fluff. I'm this marshmallow cream. All right? Yeah, some days it's good, some days it's not so good. Some days the cream has gone sour. Okay? But so I don't judge them. I don't tell my pastor friends you're going to hell because you don't use a liturgy, or you're sinning because you don't use liturgy. I just say you're stupid, you're foolish. Why take all that upon yourself when you have 2,000 years of church history and practice to fall back on? And why only have Lord's Supper once or twice a month when you could have it every Sunday? That way you make sure you got plenty of gospel in your services. Now, you don't have to worry whether or not your sermon's got gospel in it or not. You don't have to worry if you're having an off day. I just tell them, you guys are just foolish. I don't understand why you would do that to yourself. Yeah.
What is the WELS official standing on communion? Do they say you don't?
They don't have one.
So you can have it or don't have it?
That's right. And there are Welsh churches that never have a communion service. Ever. Well, they have it privately. After everybody else is gone, after the service is over,
Once it can come.
Yeah. And then, we're going to go in this secret room over here. We're going to go in this private room, and we're going to have Lord's Supper, and we're going to do that. If you really think you need that, we'll do that. Okay. So yeah, and I have tried over the years to get an official statement, and I'm told this. Well, you're judging. I said, well, not really. I'm feeling bad for those church members who belong to a church. Why they would belong to that church? Well, they belong to the church because it's got a good band. It's got a good band, It's got a good band, and the pastor's glib, and he tells really good jokes, and he's dressed like this, usually on Sunday, and we're all casual, and we call him Pastor Jim. Hey, Pastor Jim, how you doing? Oh, I'm just fine.
But those band members are sinners. You can't listen to their music.
Well, some of them are.
Yeah, but we can't listen to their music because they're sinners.
Oh, well, yeah, that's true. Anyway, what are some other items or practices that tempt believers today to judge one another? And we'll actually read verses on everything next time. But anybody, you want to start there? We can start there next time too, for that matter. But can you think of anything that pops up right away? I mean, I can think of a couple right away. I mean, booze, obviously. Okay?
Yeah,
Huh?
7 day Advent.
We'll say, yeah, some, you know, and that booze, you know, smoking,
The
good.
way they dress,
Huh?
the way they dress.
Yeah, way they dress, right? Oh yeah, like the Amish, you know, can't have buttons. Got to have hooks, I guess it is, right? Hooks, I think. Okay. Baptism, yeah. Oh yeah, you got to be immersed, right? Okay, got to be immersed. Yeah. That fits in there, you know. To judge one another, yeah. So yeah, there are a lot of things, and if you think of more, we can talk about that next time too. So we'll have fun next
Well,
time.
you'll have fun without me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know.
Next time we'll have fun.
The last Tuesday.
Well, I thought you said you're not, that we're gonna have fun without you. Where are you going?
No, I'm not going. No,
Terry,
without him. He won't be here next week. He won't be here next week.
Terry, where are you going?
I don't know yet.
He's going to find someplace cool.
Terry, have you ever tried Canada?
Yeah, actually, it's about, I gotta convert Celsius.
You wanna probably go someplace cool that's not quite so far away. If you want to get there quicker, right?
Yeah,
You want to go up the hill.
oh, yeah,
You want to go up the hill, yeah,
sure.
yeah. Here's the thing. You want to go up there. You want to go to Safford. No. You're driving your rig, right?
Yeah, so.
Okay. No. Go to Lordsburg, not Safford. Go to Lordsburg, and then go from Lordsburg to Silver City. Okay, and then for Silver City, you know, and go up through Glenwood, and
East.
that's okay. You're going north all the time.
Yeah,
You're going north
that's
all the time. So you're getting where, but it's very nice and cool. This road, I'll show you.
Okay,
I'll show you on a map.
okay.
Because you're gonna go through the forest up there.
Yeah, and don't take 191.
No.
No, out of Safford. No, don't do that because it goes like this, and your rig won't be able to make it around some of those corners.
Okay.
But the other highway, I think it's 70, that goes out of Silver City
Yeah.
and goes up north, and then eventually gets up into the White Mountains. That's a much better road, much better road. And Glenwood's down in a hollow, and so it's cool and green.
Really?
Yeah, nice. All right.
Almost sounds so good that I might be sitting if I go there.
Yeah. Don't try to go to Mogollon though, because your rig will never get to Mogollon.
Okay.
But you might take a bicycle, go down to Mogollon. That would be fun. But coming back up would not be fun.
Yeah,
Let's close. May the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us all. Amen.
Pastor,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
is the only reason the Baptists and such believe you need to be dunked because of this verse where it says Jesus came up out of the water?
No, that's not the only reason.